Have you ever noticed how easy it is to spot what's wrong with other people? The way someone talks, the way they dress, how they chew their food, the mistakes they make at work, the bad decisions they choose in relationships. We see it, we judge it. And let's be honest, there's a strange, almost addictive pleasure in doing so. It's not always loud or obvious. Sometimes it's a quiet, smug voice in the back of our mind saying, "I would never do that." Other times, it's a casual complaint we toss into a conversation over coffee. "Did you hear what she did? Unbelievable." And yet, how often do we turn that same sharp, critical gaze inward? How often do we really, truly look at our own minds and ask, what am I doing wrong? Where am I falling short? The truth is, most of us don't. Not because we're incapable, but because it's uncomfortable. It's so much easier to project our frustrations, our insecurities, our disappointments onto the flaws of others than to confront the restless shadows of our own hearts. From the time we're young, we're conditioned to measure ourselves against the people around us. We compare, we compete, we criticize. It becomes a habit, a survival instinct, a way to feel superior in a world that constantly reminds us of our inadequacies. But here's where it gets interesting. The great spiritual masters, the sages, the wise monks sitting in ancient forests and modern cities alike, they all point to the same thing. True wisdom begins the moment you stop blaming others and start seeing your own faults. In the teachings of the Buddha, there's a famous verse. It is easy to see the faults of others, but hard to see one's own. One sifts the faults of others like chaff, but hides one's own as a crafty cheater hides his dice. Let that sink in. It's easy to see the faults of others. It takes courage to see your own, and not just the surface-level mistakes. Not the obvious things like forgetting a meeting or losing your temper in traffic, but the deeper patterns. The greed disguised as ambition, the envy masquerading as righteous anger, the stubbornness we call standing our ground, the subtle pride we wrap in the cloak of humility. We spend so much of our lives looking outward, scanning the world for things to fix, people to correct, situations to control. But every wise tradition, from Zen monasteries in Japan to the forests of ancient India, whispers the same truth. The real battle, the only battle worth fighting, is within. It's not that the world doesn't have problems. Of course it does. But the lens through which you see those problems is shaped by the state of your own mind. A restless, angry heart will find faults everywhere. A peaceful, understanding heart sees challenges, yes, but meets them with patience and grace. You've probably experienced this yourself. Ever had a day when everything seems to irritate you? The barista's too slow, the driver cuts you off, your friend cancels plans. It feels like the universe is out to get you. But the next day, with a clear mind and a calm heart, those same things happen and somehow they don't bother you at all. The world didn't change. You did. That's the illusion of blame. It tricks us into believing the source of our discomfort is out there, when it's almost always in here. And the dangerous part is that this habit feeds itself. The more you blame others, the less responsibility you feel for your own state of mind. And the less you examine your own mind, the more it accumulates unchecked fears, hidden grudges, and unspoken insecurities. Like dust in a room no one cleans because they're too busy complaining about the neighbor's dirty yard. But here's the beautiful, almost terrifying truth. The moment you stop blaming, the moment you turn your gaze inward, everything begins to change. Not because the world gets easier, but because you finally begin to see yourself clearly. And when you see yourself clearly, not through the fog of ego or the excuses of circumstance, you start to realize something profound. Most of your suffering has never been about other people. It's been about the way you perceive them, the expectations you impose, the the judgments you cling to, the stories you tell yourself about who you are and what you deserve. It takes an enormous amount of humility to admit this. But once you do, life stops feeling like a constant battle against everyone else and starts becoming a quiet, tender practice of understanding yourself. This is what the ancients called true seeing. Not the seeing of the eyes, but the seeing of the heart. And it's the first, essential step on any spiritual path. You can chant mantras for 1,000 lifetimes. You can memorize scriptures, debate philosophy, meditate for hours each day. But if you refuse to look at your own faults, to own them, to understand them, to transform them, you remain a stranger to yourself. And a stranger cannot be at peace. The illusion of blame is seductive because it offers a simple, temporary relief. It's not me, it's them. But true peace, lasting peace, is born from the far more difficult, far more courageous admission. It's me. And when you finally say that, with sincerity and softness, you don't break. You awaken. That's where our journey begins. Because while it's easy to point out what's wrong in others, it's infinitely more powerful and infinitely more freeing to recognize what needs to change within. So let's begin there. Let's begin with ourselves. So here we are, standing quietly at the edge of a truth most people spend their entire lives avoiding. If we're brave enough to admit it, the greatest source of our suffering isn't the world. It isn't the people who betrayed us. It isn't the job we lost, the love we couldn't keep, or the future that slipped through our fingers. No, it's something much closer, something far more intimate. The root of suffering lies within. And that right there is the hardest thing for the human ego to accept. You see, from the moment we're born, the mind begins weaving stories about who we are and how the world should be. It divides everything into categories. Good and bad, right and wrong, me and them, safe and dangerous. And when reality refuses to fit those neat little boxes, as it always does, we suffer. Not because of what happens, but because of the way we resist what happens. A Buddhist master once said, "Pain is inevitable, suffering is optional." Read that again. Pain is part of life. Your body will ache. People you love will leave. Things you care about will change. That's the nature of this world. But suffering is what happens when you attach to the belief that it shouldn't be this way. And here's where it gets interesting. That resistance, that clinging, grasping, desperate need for life to follow your script comes from one place. Your own mind. Not your neighbors, not your bosses, not the governments. Yours. Think about the last time something upset you. A rude comment, a missed opportunity, an unexpected loss. In that moment, what hurt wasn't the event itself. It was the story your mind immediately told about it. How dare they say that to me? This always happens to me. I'll never get another chance like this. It's not the rain that ruins your day. It's the belief that it shouldn't be raining. And so, like a snake eating its own tail, we create endless loops of misery for ourselves. The mind generates a thought. We believe it. That belief triggers an emotion. The emotion fuels another thought, and the cycle continues. This is what Buddhist philosophy calls dukkha, often translated as suffering, but more accurately understood as a sense of unease, dissatisfaction, and restlessness that clings to the human condition. It's not a flaw in you. It's not a sign that you're broken. It's simply the nature of a mind left unchecked. Most people try to escape this unease by changing their external circumstances. A new relationship, a better job, more money, a different city. But eventually, no matter where you run, you find yourself again. Because wherever you go, there you are. And until you understand the true source of your suffering, you'll keep chasing temporary fixes. Distraction after distraction. Blame after blame. Never realizing that the enemy you're fighting has always been living in your own head. This is why the ancient masters turned inward, why hermits left cities, why monks shaved their heads and sat in silent forests, not to escape the world but to confront the mind directly, to study its tricks, to watch the endless parade of thoughts rise and fall like waves on an ocean, to learn that thoughts are not facts, feelings are not commands. And most of the suffering we experience is a ghost story we keep telling ourselves. You don't need to abandon your life to see this. You just need to start paying attention. Start noticing how quickly your mind reacts, how it labels, judges, predicts, how it clings to praise and resents criticism, how it builds entire catastrophes from a single word or glance. And when you catch it, gently, without judgment, remind yourself. This is just a thought, not reality. The Zen masters had a beautiful phrase, let it come, let it stay, let it go. They weren't talking about people or circumstances. They were talking about the mind, about learning to sit with your discomfort, to watch your fears and attachments rise and fall without getting swept away. Because the moment you see that you are not your thoughts, you are not your emotions, you are the awareness behind them, that's the moment suffering begins to lose its grip. And you realize the root of suffering was never the world. It was the stories you believed about it. You stop being a victim of circumstance and start becoming the master of your own inner world. Not by controlling life, you can't, but by understanding your relationship to it. This is what every true spiritual path invites us to do, not to escape suffering, but to see it clearly, to trace it back to its source, and in doing so, to free ourselves from the invisible chains we've carried for lifetimes. Because in the end, the world will always be what it is. The storms will come, people will disappoint you, plans will unravel. But if you can calm the storm within, nothing out there can touch you. And that is freedom. Freedom not from pain, but from unnecessary suffering. Not from the chaos of life, but from the chaos of your own mind. And once you taste even a drop of that peace, you'll never want to go back. Which brings us to a question most of us never stop to ask. If the mind creates suffering, what exactly is this mind? And why does it behave this way? Let's dive deeper. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How we can spend hours analyzing other people's flaws, but rarely pause to see our own. Why is that? Why is it so intoxicating, so irresistible to judge, to criticize, to measure ourselves against others? If you watch closely, you'll see it everywhere. At the dinner table, in online comments, at work, at school, in temples and churches. Human beings love to talk about what they're doing wrong. And if you trace this pattern back to its source, you'll find a familiar culprit hiding behind the curtain, the ego. Ah yes, the ego. That fragile, restless thing inside us that's constantly asking, am I enough? Do I matter? Am I better than them? The ego survives by comparison. It can't exist in isolation. Like a shadow, it needs something to contrast itself against. And so it plays its favorite game, judging others. It whispers, look at how foolish they are. At least you're not like that. See how ungrateful, how arrogant, how lost they are. In those moments, the ego feels big, powerful, superior, validated. But here's the trap. The more you judge others, the more you separate yourself from them. And the more you separate yourself, the lonelier you become. You start living in a mental prison of constant measurement. Who's better? Who's worse? Who's winning? Who's losing? And every interaction turns into a silent competition. Even your own happiness starts depending on how well you think you're performing in this invisible contest. But the ancient masters knew something the modern world often forgets. Judgment is never about the other person. It's always about you. When you find yourself bothered by someone's arrogance, it's often a reflection of your own unacknowledged pride. When you resent someone's success, It points to your own hidden insecurities. When you can't stand someone's weakness, it reveals a part of yourself you refuse to face. The world, you see, is a mirror, and every person you meet is holding up a piece of it. The Zen teacher Shunryu Suzuki once said, "In the beginner's mind there are many possibilities. In the expert's mind there are few." Judgment is what closes the door to those possibilities. It keeps you trapped in a rigid story about how things should be and blinds you to how they actually are. But here's where it gets truly dangerous. Judging others prevents you from seeing yourself. Because as long as you're pointing out someone else's flaws, you never have to confront your own. It's a clever trick of the ego. It directs your gaze outward so you can avoid the difficult work of looking inward. And yet, real peace, real freedom, real wisdom can only be found by turning that gaze around. By asking, why does this bother me so much? What part of me is being threatened or exposed here? What am I refusing to see about myself? These are terrifying questions for the ego because they threaten its survival. But for the spirit, they are the doorway to liberation. Buddha taught that seeing your own faults is the beginning of wisdom, not because you should drown in guilt or self-loathing, but because only when you see them clearly without denial can you begin to let them go. The irony is the more you judge others, the heavier you become. Your heart closes, your mind tightens, your peace shrinks. But the moment you release the need to rank, to compare, to prove, something miraculous happens. You become lighter. You start to see people not as threats, but as fellow travelers, equally lost, equally searching, equally flawed and sacred. Their mistakes stop being personal insults. Their arrogance stops being a reflection on you. Their success stops being your loss. And you realize the only thing you've ever been fighting was your own distorted reflection in the mirror. Imagine walking through the world like that, not needing to judge, to measure, to compete. Not because you've become indifferent, but because you've understood that we're all made of the same clay. The same fears, the same longings, the same fragile hopes. When someone speaks harshly, you see the pain behind it. When someone acts foolishly, you remember the times you did too. When someone flaunts their pride, you recognize the insecurity hidden underneath. And instead of tightening, your heart softens. This is not weakness, it's wisdom. Because the truly wise don't waste energy judging the surface. They see through it. They look deeper, and in doing so, they free themselves. So the next time you catch yourself judging, pause, not to suppress it, but to study it. Ask yourself, what does this say about me? Not as a way to shame yourself, but as a doorway to greater awareness. Because in the end, every judgment you release is a chain you drop. And the less you carry, the lighter you walk through this brief, mysterious life. The masters understood this, and in the silence of their wisdom, they discovered a secret most of the world has forgotten. The most powerful thing you can do in a noisy, judgmental world is to quietly see yourself. Which brings us to something even more fascinating. Why is it so difficult to see our own faults while we're so quick to see everyone else's? Let's take a closer look. There's a quiet kind of courage this world rarely celebrates. It's not the kind that makes headlines, not the bravery of soldiers or the defiance of protesters or the resilience of survivors. It's the courage to look inward, to turn your gaze away from the faults of others and place it steadily, unflinchingly upon yourself, to truly see. Most people spend their entire lives avoiding this. Not because they're evil, but because it hurts. Because to see your own faults means confronting the parts of yourself you've worked so hard to ignore. It means admitting you're not always kind, not always honest, not always wise. It means recognizing your pride, your envy, your pettiness, your insecurities. And it shatters the comforting story you've carefully built about who you are. But here's the truth the ancient masters understood. Without true seeing, there can be no true peace. As long as you're blind to your own faults, you remain a prisoner, chained by patterns you can't recognize, haunted by shadows you refuse to name, trapped in cycles you don't even realize you're repeating. This is why the Buddha taught that seeing your own faults is the beginning of wisdom, not because it makes you less worthy, but because it makes you honest. And honesty is freedom. Imagine for a moment a person walking through a dark forest. They keep tripping over roots, getting scratched by thorns, and blaming the path for being cruel. But what if they simply lit a lamp? What if, instead of cursing the darkness, they learned to see where they were stepping? That's what recognizing your own faults does. It turns on the light, and suddenly the obstacles aren't gone, but you see them clearly. You stop tripping over the same anger, the same jealousy, the same stubbornness. You learn to move differently, more carefully, more consciously. The great Zen master Bankei once told his students, "Don't try to get rid of your faults. Just be aware of them, because awareness itself begins to dissolve them. But let's be honest, it's not easy. The ego will fight you at every step. It will justify, it will blame, it will distract. It will find 100 clever reasons why they are the problem and you are not. This is the oldest trick in the book, and it works for a while. But over time, you'll start to notice a quiet dissatisfaction, a restlessness that no amount of distractions can cure, a nagging sense that you're carrying something heavy you can't quite name. And that's the signal, the silent invitation to turn inward, not to punish yourself, not to drown in guilt, but to see, to catch yourself in those subtle moments of pride, to notice the way your words sometimes carry hidden daggers, to realize how often your kindness is laced with quiet expectations. This is the power of true seeing. It's not dramatic. It's not about confessing your sins to the world. It happens in private, in silence, in the unseen corners of your mind. But its effects are monumental, because once you see something clearly, it starts to lose its grip on you. The anger that once erupted without warning softens. The envy that gnawed at you fades. The craving for approval weakens, not because you fought them, but because you finally saw them for what they are. And that seeing changes everything. It's like waking up from a dream you didn't know you were having. The world looks different. People's flaws stop feeling like personal offenses. Your own mistakes become teachers instead of enemies. And slowly, a strange new peace begins to settle in your heart. Not because life has become easier, but because you've stopped being at war with yourself. This is the doorway to wisdom, to compassion, to genuine freedom. Because when you truly see your own faults, you stop expecting perfection from others. You stop needing to win every argument. You stop being so easily hurt by other people's ignorance. Why? Because you recognize it in yourself. And that recognition softens you. It makes you patient. It makes you kind. It makes you humble in the way only those who have wrestled with their own shadows can be. So the next time you feel that familiar rush of judgment or anger or hurt, pause. Ask yourself, what is this revealing about me? Not as a weapon, but as a mirror, as a gentle light in the dark forest of your own heart. Because every time you see yourself clearly, without excuses, without denial, you take one step closer to real peace. And with each step, the heavy chains fall away, one by one, leaving you lighter and freer, and a little bit wiser. And as you walk this quieter, clearer path, something remarkable happens. You begin to see others more clearly too. Not as enemies, not as obstacles, but as fellow travelers, equally flawed, equally sacred, equally lost, and equally worthy of compassion. And in that seeing, a new kind of love is born, the kind not built on illusions, but on truth. And perhaps that's the only love that ever truly lasts. There's a peculiar danger that waits quietly for those who walk the path of self-reflection. It arrives not when you're lost, but when you start believing you've found yourself. It whispers not in your moments of weakness, but in the glow of your supposed virtue. And it has a name: self-righteousness. It's one of the subtlest traps on the spiritual path, because it wears the disguise of wisdom. It pretends to be humility. It poses as morality. But underneath, it's just another face of the ego. You see, once you begin to see your own faults, truly see them, a certain pride can quietly take root. A sense of being better than those who remain blind. A belief that because you are now aware, you've somehow transcended the very flaws you've only just begun to notice. It's intoxicating. You start comparing yourself silently, invisibly. At least I'm not like them. I've faced my darkness, they're still running. I'm more awake, more mindful, more evolved. And without realizing it, your ego slips in through the back door, not as arrogance but as virtue. It's what the old Zen masters called the stink of enlightenment, when your spiritual pride smells worse than your old ignorance. And here's the cruel irony: this kind of righteousness feels good. It feels clean. It feels just. But it's poison, because it separates you from others. It turns fellow humans into spiritual projects. It makes compassion conditional. It replaces true kindness with quiet condescension. And worst of all, it blinds you again. You stop seeing your faults because you're too busy measuring how far you've come. You stop learning because you think you've arrived. But wisdom, real wisdom, is always unfinished. The most awakened masters were the humblest souls. Not because they thought less of themselves, but because they saw no self to boast about. They knew how easily the mind could trick itself, how even clarity can become a mask. The Buddha himself warned of this. He taught that the path isn't just about abandoning desire or anger or ignorance, but also about abandoning the conceit of having abandoned them. That's the final chain, the one people rarely see, the one made of their own virtue. And so the question is, how do we avoid this trap? The answer isn't to deny your progress or pretend you haven't grown. It's to hold your insights lightly, to remember that every realization is just a door, not a destination. That clarity today doesn't guarantee clarity tomorrow. That you are a guest in this moment of wisdom, not its owner. And most importantly, to never use your path as a weapon, not against yourself, not against others. If you notice yourself silently judging the less awakened, pause. If you find yourself thinking, they should be more like me, pause. If you're craving recognition for your inner work, pause. And in that pause, ask yourself, who is it that wants to be better? Who is it that needs to be right? Because the self-righteous mind always speaks in comparison. It cannot exist without someone to look down upon. But wisdom, true wisdom, stands alone. It doesn't need an audience. It doesn't seek approval. It doesn't measure itself against the ignorance of others. It simply is. Like the sun, shining on saints and sinners alike. Like the wind, touching both kings and beggars without preference. The great sages were not revered because they proclaimed their virtue. They were revered because they became so empty of themselves that people felt peace just being near them. They didn't have to declare their enlightenment. It declared itself through their silence, through their presence, through their unshakable kindness. And this is the path we must choose again and again, not the easy satisfaction of moral superiority, not the seductive glow of being more conscious than others, but the difficult, beautiful discipline of seeing your own self-righteousness when it appears, not with shame, not with drama, just with awareness. And in that awareness, it begins to lose its power. Like a shadow exposed to light, it shrinks, and you find yourself a little lighter, a little freer, a little less desperate to be better than. Because when you stop needing to be above others, you finally stand beside them, not as a master, not as a judge, but as a fellow human, flawed, beautiful, ever unfolding. And perhaps in that quiet equality, the real spiritual work begins. There's a quiet wisdom passed down through centuries, not written in books, not shouted from pulpits, but whispered in the hearts of those who have truly seen. A wisdom so simple, so counterintuitive, it almost feels like madness to the ordinary mind. It says, the wise always blame themselves first. At first, this sounds harsh, almost unfair. Why should someone who strives for goodness shoulder blame when things go wrong? Why take responsibility when others are clearly at fault? But this teaching has nothing to do with guilt, nothing to do with self-punishment, and everything to do with freedom. You see, the untrained mind is always looking outward. When trouble comes, it asks, "Who did this to me?" When things fall apart, it points fingers. When insulted, it blames the offender. When disappointed, it resents the world. It's a reflex, a survival instinct. And for most people, it's the only way they've ever known how to live. But the wise, they see deeper. They understand that no one can truly harm you but yourself. No one can steal your peace without your permission. No event can disturb your inner world unless you allow it. And every experience, good or bad, is a mirror reflecting your own state of mind. When someone insults them, they don't ask, "Why is this person so cruel?" They ask, "Why did those words pierce me? What inside me was waiting to be wounded?" When a plan crumbles, they don't rage at fate. They examine their own expectations. When people disappoint them, they don't drown in bitterness. They look at the attachments they unknowingly built. Because in every conflict, every pain, every heartbreak, there's a lesson. And the one who can find that lesson fastest is the one who suffers least. It's not weakness, it's supreme strength. To turn the lens inward before pointing it outward. To question your own contribution to suffering before condemning the world. And strangely, this isn't about excusing others. It's not about pretending injustice doesn't exist, or pretending others didn't act poorly, or denying the reality of human cruelty. No, it's about choosing where your power lies. Because if your peace depends on the kindness of others, you'll never know peace. If your joy relies on a flawless world, you'll forever be chasing shadows. The wise refuse to be prisoners of circumstance. They claim full responsibility, not for the actions of others, but for their own responses. And here's the miracle. In doing so, they transcend blame altogether. They stop playing the exhausting game of who's right, who's wrong. They simply ask, what can this teach me about myself? And in that question, the world transforms. Every difficult person becomes a mirror. Every setback becomes a lesson. Every wound reveals where healing is needed. It's not an easy path. It demands ruthless honesty. It requires you to confront parts of yourself you'd rather deny. The pride, the fear, the attachments, the insecurities. But as each is seen and understood, they lose their grip. You become less reactive, less easily disturbed, less caught in the storm of other people's chaos, and more rooted, more clear, more compassionate. Because you realize most people are at war with themselves. Their anger, their cruelty, their betrayals have nothing to do with you. They are projections of their own suffering. And when you understand this, you no longer take their arrows personally. You see them for what they are, echoes of pain, calls for help, proof of how lost the human mind can be. And you no longer need to defend yourself. Because you're no longer a target. You've left the battlefield. This is why the wise blame themselves first, not to invite unnecessary suffering, not to carry the sins of others, but because in doing so, they reclaim their freedom. They become masters of their inner world. They learn the art of transforming every injury into insight, every hardship into growth. And in the quiet of their heart, they know, no one can harm me without my consent. That's real power, not in controlling the world, but in no longer needing to. And when you live this way, a strange peace follows you, like a silent companion, in every storm, in every conflict, in every moment when the old mind wants to blame. A peace that says, I see where this really comes from. I see the wound inside me this touched, and I choose to heal, not to fight. The masters of old didn't teach this to shame us. They taught it because they had walked through the fire and come out unburned. They wanted us to know it's possible to live unshaken, possible to be invincible, not because the world is kind, but because your mind is clear. And that is a kind of victory no one can take from you. There's a heaviness we carry, a weight most of us don't even realize is strapped to our backs. It isn't the burden of our own mistakes. It's the endless tally we keep of others' faults. We remember every slight, every betrayal, every word that stung, every moment someone didn't live up to the image we built of them. And day by day it builds. A silent, invisible load. It clings to us when we wake. It follows us through conversations. It poisons our peace. Yet strangely, we clutch it tighter. We replay old wounds in our minds like cherished trophies. She lied to me. He was never there when I needed him. They took advantage of my kindness. And with every memory, we reinforce a simple, deadly belief. I am a victim of other people's flaws. But what we fail to see is that this belief cages us. It's a prison of our own making, a trap cleverly disguised as righteousness. Because the moment you attach your peace to someone else's behavior, you surrender control over your life. You hand the keys of your mind to strangers, to their moods, to their ignorance, to their imperfections. And the tragic part, most of those people aren't even thinking about you. They've moved on, living their messy, complicated, beautifully flawed lives, while you're still bleeding from wounds they forgot they inflicted. This is why every spiritual tradition, every wisdom path, every enlightened teacher has, in one way or another, whispered the same advice. Let it go. Not for their sake, but for yours. Because holding on to someone's faults is like drinking poison and waiting for them to suffer. You exhaust yourself carrying stories that no longer serve you. You dull your light trying to control a world that was never meant to be perfect. And every moment spent stewing over someone else's shortcomings is a moment stolen from your own peace. Letting go isn't about pretending people didn't hurt you. It isn't about denying injustice or excusing cruelty. It's about choosing your sanity over your grudge. It's about understanding a profound, unshakable truth. The only mind you are responsible for is your own. And that's where your freedom lives. When you truly see this, the faults of others lose their power over you. Their anger doesn't infect you. Their betrayal doesn't define you. Their ignorance no longer dictates your peace. You become light. Like a traveler who realizes halfway through a long, punishing journey that their pack was filled with stones they never needed to carry. You feel it immediately, the unburdening, the unclenching of your heart, the space between thoughts widening, the sudden, almost shocking quiet where endless noise once lived. This is not weakness. This is mastery. The strongest person isn't the one who can conquer others. It's the one who no longer needs to. And strangely, when you stop obsessing over other people's faults, you begin to see them more clearly. Not as villains, not as saints, but as fellow travelers, lost, confused, acting from their own wounds. Some, you'll realize, never meant to hurt you. They were too tangled in their own suffering to notice yours. Others, you'll see, acted from ignorance, not malice. And a few truly did wrong. But even they are caught in the same prison of mind you're learning to escape. The wise don't excuse harm. They simply refuse to carry it longer than they have to. They understand that every moment spent replaying someone else's offense is a moment stolen from their own awakening. And so quietly, firmly, without drama, they let it go. Not because it wasn't real, not because it didn't hurt, but because their freedom matters more. There's a saying in the old Zen tradition, the second arrow is yours. The first arrow is life, what others do, what fate delivers. The second is your reaction, and that one you control. When you learn to drop the second arrow, you stop bleeding from wounds you no longer need to nurse. You step out of old stories, you put down ancient burdens, and you remember what peace feels like. It's not loud, it doesn't announce itself, but it's unmistakable, a stillness beneath the noise, a clarity beyond the fog. A space wide enough for compassion even for those who hurt you. Because now you see the truth, they didn't ruin your peace. Your attachment to their faults did. And in releasing it, you reclaim what was always yours. Your mind, your heart, your freedom. Let it go, not tomorrow, not after one more conversation, not when they apologize. Now, this breath, this moment. Because every time you release one more stone from your pack, you walk lighter. And the path ahead, the one that leads to peace, to wisdom, to a life unshaken, becomes a little clearer. There's a quiet practice known only to the truly wise. It's not loud. It doesn't need applause, and no one will likely ever see you do it. But it might just be the most important thing you'll ever learn. It's called daily self-reflection. Not the shallow kind where you casually think, yeah, maybe I was a little impatient today. Not the self-pitying spiral where you beat yourself up for every flaw. I'm talking about the courageous, unflinching, almost surgical kind of seeing. The kind where you sit with yourself, no mask, no performance, no escape, and ask, where did my mind go today? What was I chasing? What did I cling to? Where did I poison myself by judging, blaming, envying? It sounds simple, but it is. Because to do this honestly is to willingly look into the very places most people spend their entire lives avoiding. And that's precisely why it works. See, the real damage in life rarely comes from the big mistakes we make once or twice. It's the small, unnoticed habits of mind we repeat day after day after day. The tiny moments of pettiness, the quiet resentments, the flashes of superiority we tell ourselves don't matter, but they do. They shape who you are. They sculpt the world you live in. And worst of all, they accumulate. Left unchecked, they harden into personality, into destiny. And you wake up one day wondering how you became this person so restless, so bitter, so weighed down by your own unseen shadows. That's why the ancient masters practiced daily reflection. Because the mind, like a garden, grows whatever you plant. And if you don't inspect it, weeds flourish. But here's the beautiful truth. It doesn't take years of penance or exile in a cave to start reclaiming your inner world. It only takes a few honest moments a day. You can begin right now. At the end of each evening, before sleep claims you, find a quiet space. No phone, no distractions, just you, your breath, and a question. What did my heart look like today? Did you speak with kindness? Did you act from fear? Where did envy creep in? Where did your ego puff itself up, demanding to be right, to be better, to be seen? Don't excuse it. Don't explain it away. And for heaven's sake, don't punish yourself. Just see it. Because seeing is the beginning of freedom. It might sting. It often does. You'll notice patterns you wish weren't there. Old wounds you thought you'd outgrown. Reactions that feel beneath you. But this discomfort, this raw, unfiltered honesty is where true growth lives. Not in pretending to be flawless. Not in comparing yourself to others. But in courageously meeting yourself exactly as you are, moment by moment. And here's the secret. The more you do this, the lighter you'll feel. Because most of our suffering isn't from what happens to us. It's from what we refuse to see about ourselves. When you stop hiding, life softens. Suddenly, that sharp, critical voice loses its grip. The restless need to control others fades. The endless chasing of validation feels unnecessary. And a quiet strength takes its place. A strength rooted not in perfection, but in presence. You start walking through life less burdened. Not because the world changed, but because you did. Because you cleaned the window of your own mind. And what once felt chaotic, unbearable, intolerable, begins to feel manageable, even beautiful in its imperfection. You begin to understand why the old Zen masters smiled so easily, why they spoke so little, why their presence felt like a mountain, calm and unshaken. It wasn't magic, it was practice. And you can begin that same practice now, not tomorrow, not after the next crisis, not when you feel more spiritual. Now this night, this breath, this reflection, start simply. Write it down if you like. 3 things you noticed about yourself today where you clung, where you let go, where you forgot yourself in kindness, where you lost yourself in judgment. And then forgive yourself. You're a human being on an ancient path walked by countless before you. Every master was once a mess. Every sage once fell for the same illusions you're unraveling. The difference is they chose to see. And when you do that, even imperfectly, something remarkable happens. You stop fearing your flaws. They become teachers, not threats. You stop being at war with yourself. And in that inner truce, you'll find something the world can't give you and can't take away. A peace so steady, so quietly radiant that no praise can inflate it, no insult can pierce it, because you've met yourself. And you kept meeting yourself, day after day. And the miracle is that's all it takes. Just one honest, unflinching look a day. That is the art of daily self-reflection, and it will change everything. There's a strange thing about human nature. The more fragile someone feels inside, the louder they tend to be. The more uncertain, the more they crave to prove themselves. And the more insecure, the more obsessed they become with appearing strong. But appearances are a cheap currency. Real strength isn't loud, it isn't flashy, and it has nothing to do with titles, muscles, or the size of your following. Real strength lives in humility. Now, to most people, humility sounds like weakness, a soft, apologetic quality that shrinks in the face of power. But nothing could be further from the truth. Humility is not about thinking less of yourself. It's about thinking of yourself less. It's about moving through the world without needing to dominate every room, win every argument, or constantly defend your image. Because when you're truly strong, you don't have to keep proving it. You're no longer threatened by other people's success. You don't need to belittle anyone to feel taller, and you can admit your mistakes without your ego shattering into pieces. Why? Because your sense of worth no longer depends on illusions. It's grounded in something deeper. You realize, as all the wise have before you, that nothing in this world is really yours. Not your looks, not your wealth, not your reputation, not even this body you cling to so desperately. Everything rises and falls. Fortunes shift. Glory fades. Praises turn to criticism in a heartbeat. And when you see this clearly, when you stop pretending that your little tower of status will save you, something remarkable happens. You relax. For the first time, you can simply be. You can listen without the need to interrupt. You can learn without the fear of appearing foolish. You can serve without expecting applause. And in doing so, you discover a kind of inner power no one can touch. Because humility isn't about self-deprecation. It's not about playing small. It's about knowing the exact weight of your strengths and weaknesses and being at peace with both. It's about standing firm in your truth while making space for others to stand in theirs. About bowing when it's needed, not out of submission, but out of wisdom. The ancient masters spoke of this often. In Zen monasteries, even the most revered abbots would sweep floors, wash bowls, and tend to gardens. Not as a performance, but because they understood. The moment you believe you're too important for simple, humble work is the moment you begin to lose yourself. And isn't that what so many suffer from today? A constant striving to be somebody, to be seen, to be celebrated, to be the loudest voice in every room. But here's the paradox: the more you chase importance, the emptier you feel. Because no external recognition can ever fill the space inside meant for inner peace. True strength lies in knowing you don't need to be worshipped. You don't need to be the smartest, the fastest, the most admired. You just need to be real. And to be real is to be humble. It means walking through life knowing you'll always have blind spots, that you'll forever be a work in progress, and that no matter how far you climb, life has a way of humbling everyone. The wise don't fear this, they welcome it, because they know that humility isn't a punishment, it's a protection. It keeps your heart soft, your mind open, and your soul light. In a world obsessed with image, humility makes you untouchable. When you're no longer a slave to praise, no insult can wound you. When you no longer cling to your rank, no setback can shake you. You become like a mountain, steady, silent, unmoved by storms, and those around you feel it. Not through your words, but through your presence. People sense when someone carries true strength, not in their volume, but in their stillness. You meet the arrogant with patience. You meet criticism with curiosity. And you meet each day not as a master of the world, but as a student of it. That's humility. And in it, you'll find a power so rare, so unshakable, it will quietly transform your entire life. Not with fireworks, not with drama, but with the simple, steady peace of someone who no longer needs to be better than anyone else. Because you finally understand, you were never in competition to begin with. At the end of every journey, there comes a moment of stillness, a quiet space, where the noise settles, the dust clears, and what remains is simply you, not the version you perform for the world, not the image you defend, but the raw, unpolished, quietly breathing truth of who you really are. And in that moment, if you dare to look closely, you'll find something extraordinary. A mirror, not made of glass, but woven from the silent threads of your heart. This mirror doesn't reflect your face, your status, your triumphs or failures. It shows you your faults, your clinging, your judgments, your arrogance. And it does so not to shame you, but to free you. Because in seeing your flaws clearly, you stop being enslaved by them. All along this journey, we've explored the ancient wisdom that the real enemy isn't out there. It was never your difficult neighbor, never your demanding boss, never your unpredictable circumstances. It was always the restless, grasping, self-centered voice inside, the one that blames others, avoids self-responsibility, and constantly chases validation. The ego loves to point outward, but liberation comes from turning inward, from having the courage to stand before the mirror of your heart and see what's truly there. And when you do, when you recognize your flaws without excuses, without denial, without flinching, something sacred unfolds. Your suffering softens, your mind quiets, and a lightness returns to your being, because you realize you no longer have to carry the burden of pretending to be flawless. You no longer need to fix the world before fixing yourself. And in letting go of others' faults, you release yourself from their grip. This is the path of the wise, not perfection, but relentless self-awareness, not superiority, but humility, not empty rituals, but honest inner seeing. True seeing isn't glamorous. It won't win you applause, but it will give you back your peace. It will restore your clarity, and it will quietly, invisibly transform the way you move through life. Like water carving stone, not with force, but with patience. In the end, the heart becomes what it reflects. If you spend your days searching for others' flaws, your heart will become sharp, restless, and bitter. But if you turn that gaze inward with kindness and courage, your heart becomes clear, soft, open, and in that openness lies freedom. So now, as this journey draws to a close, the invitation is simple. Before you go to sleep tonight, before you scroll through another stream of endless opinions, before you judge another face in passing, stop, sit quietly, and hold up the mirror of your heart. Ask yourself, not where others have failed you, but where you have fallen short of your own wisdom, not what the world owes you, but what you still owe yourself. And in that small, intimate moment, you'll glimpse the beginning of real peace, because the one who can see their own faults and love themselves enough to transform them has already begun to master the art of living, and that is the only mastery worth having. Thank you for walking this path with me.